He's the professor, the Henry M. Jackson Professor of International Studies at the Jackson School of International Studies here in Seattle at the University of Washington, and he has taught here since 1991. He is the author of Chen Yun and the Chinese Political System, Bureaucracy, Economy, and Leadership in China, The Institutional Origins of the Great Leap Forward, and he is the co-editor of Yan Qian and China's Struggle for Democracy. He's currently working on a book on China's defense industrialization. His PhD is from Stanford University, and he taught at Stanford and Princeton University prior to coming to the University of Washington. So David, I hand it off to you, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Christy, Eureka, and all of you for being here. And let me pull up, I hope, my PowerPoint and get started. Okay, there we are. Okay, so tonight I'm talking about Hong Kong 2021-22 behind the headlines. I guess it's 3 weeks from tonight. I'm talking about the PRC. So let me just get started. So before I get behind the headlines, just make sure we all know what the headlines were for the last year or so in Hong Kong. So the main points here are continuing deepening repression under China's national security law for Hong Kong, the further quashing of Hong Kong's arguably unique civil society, the way that society was organized to try to represent itself, to be lively and take advantage of what it inherited from the British system while trying to preserve an identity that was unique to Chinese civilizations. The elections that replaced the old chief executive, or effectively the governor of Hong Kong, and the legislative council elections that took place last fall. The effect of COVID on Hong Kong and its effects, as well as how the mainland has constrained Hong Kong's freedom of action when it comes to dealing with COVID and affects Hong Kong's economy as well. And I'll talk about China's visions for Hong Kong, as well as what happened when on July 1st, Xi Jinping made his first trip out of China, the China mainland, to come to Hong Kong to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong from the UK to China under the framework of one country, two systems, that there would be one China, Hong Kong would finally be a part of it, but they'd have two different systems of governance and of economy and so on. So I'll talk about each one of these in turn and then go on to talk about what's behind them, what's the dynamics here, or what are the dynamics here. So with that, let me just move on. Okay. Okay. Continuing deepening repression. So for those of you who've heard me talk about Hong Kong in previous years here, China passed a Hong Kong national security law in 2020 that went into effect in June or July 2020. It's a vaguely worded kind of document. It was written by the Chinese Communist Party's controlled National People's Congress in June 2020. It had little or no reflection of people in Hong Kong's view on this. In some ways, it mirrored China's own national security law for its home country, which went in 2015. It made almost anything that the Chinese Communist Party wanted to make a challenge to national security, a challenge. It was also applied retroactively, not only retroactively, but widely, especially against those who tried to defend Hong Kong's autonomy and demand more democracy and reform. And indeed, the whole range of people, whether they were democratically elected to the Legislative Council or not, tended to get rounded up, put in jail, and so on, as I'll get to in a minute. Among those arrested was Joseph Cardinal Zen, who's 90 years old, who co-headed a legal aid society because the legal aid society was trying to provide legal assistance to some arrested for protesting. Things we would think would hardly be a challenge to national security, living up to the promise of justice before the law. But for the PRC, this seemed to be enough to arrest Cardinal Zen. Also arrested were a couple of speech pathologists who wrote a children's book on a village of sheep needing to join together to defend themselves from wolves. They were tried and sentenced to multiple months in jail. This was seen by the police and by the judiciary as an allegory that Hong Kong were the sheep, the PRC were the wolves. And so this too was seen as a threat to national security. And more generally, on the 30th of July, there were something like 2,700 unconvicted people in jail in Hong Kong who were denied bail, just sitting there. They'd been sitting there in some cases for 2 years. Indeed, that was more than a third of all the people being held. And the conditions in these jails, while probably better than jails on the mainland, were fraught. The chances of acquittal were so small that many of the leaders of the 2019-2020 democracy movement have pled guilty to subversion, and some are in the process of pleading for mercy. So here's Cardinal Zen on the left picture walking with an aide. You can see he's not as in great shape. And then the picture on the right shows an illustration from this children's book about the wolves marching into the lamb's village or the sheep's village. This was a picture put up by the Hong Kong police after they had arrested the writers of this children's book, trying to make this case that it was an allegory. Okay. Excuse me. Oops, I skipped too much. Let me go back. China continues to suppress civil society, non-governmental organizations, unions, bookshops limit what they sell, the Chinese language media. They've all become much more reticent about speaking about political conditions in Hong Kong and on the mainland. And essentially all requests or demands or even considerations of any kind of political reform in Hong Kong have disappeared. The numbers of Hong Kongers who tried to pay tribute to Queen Elizabeth after her death at the British legation suggest more subtle ways by which they are trying to voice their unhappiness with the current situation. Whether China sometimes understands subtlety or deliberately doesn't understand subtlety remains to be seen. On the one hand, they certainly picked up on that children's book about the sheep and the wolves. Whether they took note of the large number of people trying to pay their respect to Queen Elizabeth and the bygone era of British colonial rule, or at least Hong Kong prior to 3 years ago or 2 years ago, is unclear. But I wouldn't want to say that Hong Kong is China yet. Social media like Facebook are not blocked. Indeed, social media is not blocked. You can be arrested for what you might say on Facebook and other social media, but it's not, you're not behind the Great Firewall as you are in the mainland. The English language press is often more critical of developments in China. The South China Morning Post, which is the biggest English language paper in Hong Kong, continues to publish and write quite revealing stories about what's going on in China. And I know at least one major NGO, one called China Labor Bulletin, continues to exist in Hong Kong, critically commenting on labor issues in China. So the situation is much worse than it was 3 years ago, but it's certainly much better than it was than it is on the mainland. And indeed, for those of you who follow these things, the international NGO Freedom House just put out its report about freedom in the world that addresses issues like freedom of the press and freedom of assembly and so on, as well as access to materials. So there we go. So here on the left, some of the mourners honoring Queen Elizabeth, paying their respects. And the picture on the right is a list of, or a number of strikes taking place in China that was put up by China Labor Bulletin earlier in September. So critical things the government in China doesn't want you to know about are still appearing in places like China Labor Bulletin, which continues to be functioning in Hong Kong. Okay. So Hong Kong also held elections for a new chief executive in 2021. That chief executive, the new chief executive, is John Lee. He replaced Carrie Lam, seen by everyone as ineffectual, by PRC as not being strong enough, by the protesters as being too weak, by the international community as being someone who was being pushed around by everyone and couldn't enforce anything. So I think everyone was happy to see her go. Most of Hong Kong probably wasn't all that happy to see John Lee become the new chief executive. He had been a former policeman. He rose up the chain of command to command the police. Just in the last several years, he's been the number 2 person in Hong Kong. When he was number 2, he was a hardliner in dealing with the 2019-2020 protests. He had Beijing's unambiguous support. Indeed, one of his jobs before he announced his candidacy was to screen and vet the loyalty of the 1,424 person body that actually votes on the chief executive. So it's maybe a surprise that 8 people voted against him out of that 1,424, but he won that election 14-16 to 8. No other person was running against him. And this body that elected him, as already noted, were already screened, vetted, and their loyalty assured, so that it was essentially making him a rubber stamp kind of choice. Earlier in 2021, there had been elections for the Legislative Council where pro-Beijing candidates won all the seats. Again, all the candidates had to be vetted as loyal to Beijing before they were allowed to run. No real opposition candidates were allowed to run. There was low turnout because large numbers of people said, what's the point of voting on this? But now you have the Legislative Council, which was already quite a weak body, having a complete unanimity, if you will, with the views of the PRC and of John Lee. So there's John Lee after the elections were counted, and then inspecting the police in Hong Kong. Okay. COVID in Hong Kong. Hong Kong did pretty well with COVID in 2020. The border with China was shut down pretty early on because doctors in the hospitals demanded it. They'd been through an earlier round of an infectious disease from China and basically assured the leadership that they couldn't handle a new upsurge. So they put in a basically closing of the border between Hong Kong and the PRC. 2020 went well, but there were with new variants of COVID. There were upsurges in Hong Kong in 2021 and 2022, leading again to the border being closed down, locking down of apartment buildings, closing of businesses, etc. There were mandatory quarantines of new arrivals that varied in length depending on how severe various upsurges were. There was a very severe upsurge in spring or March 2022 when more than 1 million cases took place in Hong Kong. Hong Kong's population is roughly 7.5 million, so we're talking about a very large number of cases in a short period of time. The death rate increased from very low levels to levels seen in many other places. So in 2020, you had a 90 times greater chance of dying from COVID in the US than you did in Hong Kong. In 2022, the rate was about 3.5 times greater in the US than in Hong Kong. Large numbers of elderly Hong Kongers had not been vaccinated, made them especially vulnerable and susceptible to the disease. Cases are down now, and mandatory quarantines were eliminated though new arrivals must PCR test for the first 3 days after arrival. That only happened last Friday. But the border with the PRC is still effectively closed. If you want to go to China, you have to follow PRC quarantine requirements of a week plus 3 days. And few, if any, mainlanders are able to get to Hong Kong. So that's been a profound shock to lots of small businesses in Hong Kong, and they're reeling if they aren't already out of business. The PRC wanted Hong Kong to put in the full close down of society that China's put in its cities. Hong Kong leaders under Carrie Lam resisted the full range of shutdowns typical of China. Chinese officials were critical of Hong Kong for that. And again, it speaks to their growing unwillingness to see Hong Kong be very different from the PRC. It is possible to get some of the Western vaccines in Hong Kong, though not all that easily. They're not available in China. Okay. So Hong Kong's economy declined in 2019. That was presumably due to the protests, and it's undoubtedly continued to decline since. The COVID measures that I've just mentioned and COVID itself have hit the economy quite hard. The lack of Chinese tourists, who made up a very substantial proportion of the tourist population in Hong Kong, has greatly harmed lots of small restaurants, small hotels, businesses that cater to sightseeing exhibitions or sightseeing groups traveling around Hong Kong. All of them have essentially gone out of business. And this has been a major blow to the standard of living of many ordinary Hong Kong residents. As well, the closed borders, the quarantining, and so on, the fear that media might be closed down, information controlled, have led a number of multinational corporations to move at least some, if not all, of their operations to other parts of Asia because of the quarantines, concerns about repression, the inability of upper-level management to fly in and out easily, and so on. And so for many multinationals, there's a reconsideration going on about how important Hong Kong might or might not be to their future operations. And it will be important still for financial services, probably legal services, accounting services, but for companies trying to do trade or investment, other than financial investments, it may be that many of them move out of Hong Kong. Reflecting both the repression, the effects of COVID, and the declining economy, for the first time since World War II, there was a decline in the population in Hong Kong. Educated middle-class Hong Kongers are looking for a better quality of life, housing for the poor, the low class, many middle-class residents is now out of reach, and the quality of life has deteriorated from the perspective of many people. Okay, so that's from a Western perspective, those might be the developments and how we read what's going on, the headlines about Hong Kong. China tells itself and tells Hong Kong a quite different story about what has been going on in Hong Kong. China sees Hong Kong arising from the ashes of what it sees as the chaos of the protests of 2019-2020. China's asserting that Hong Kong must be a loyal part of the PRC, becoming less and less different and differentiated from the rest of the country. They're not giving up one country, two systems, but they're saying the two systems are going to not be as different as they were. China does continue to see the Hong Kong stock market remaining a vital link to the global capitalist economy, partly because of its less strict listing requirements than other major international stock exchanges, partly relatedly because they think they can have more control over it, that they can affect legislation, they can protect their own companies probably better in Hong Kong than they certainly can in major markets in New York or London or elsewhere. As part of making Hong Kong loyal, the PRC is in the process of writing new textbooks for primary and secondary schools in Hong Kong. There's been talks about phasing out the teaching of English in some of the schools in Hong Kong, and emphasizing textbooks that will instill loyalty to the motherland, teaching Chinese history rather than Hong Kong history. And in some of these books, Hong Kong they refused to call Hong Kong a colony, with the rather pedantic view that only countries can be called colonies. And since Hong Kong isn't a country, it couldn't have been a colony. All of this is designed to try to, undermine this view that there might be some claim for Hong Kong being an independent entity, an independent country. So here is Xi Jinping on the left, giving a speech on the 25th anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong to the UK, Hong Kong from the UK to the PRC. And there is on the right a picture of the governance of China by Xi Jinping in a Hong Kong bookstore, where in these books, and there's now a series of them, Xi has laid out his thoughts on any number of subjects, and he speaks about Hong Kong in many of them. Okay. So then finally, celebrating 25 years of one country, two systems. So as I mentioned, Xi traveled to Hong Kong to celebrate 25 years since the British handover on July 1st. It was 1997, 2025. And as noted, it was the first trip he made outside of the mainland proper. As part of his speech, he said, at this moment, Hong Kong is entering a new stage, moving from the transition from chaos to governance, toward the transition from governance to prosperity. It should be noted that the per capita income in Hong Kong is close to 3 times that on the mainland, but he's speaking of a different kind of prosperity, one thinks, so more, and he said this for China, where there's greater equality of opportunity, less inequality, and so on. He made clear that Hong Kong is for Chinese patriots, that people who are not patriotic don't have any voice in Hong Kong, don't have any role in Hong Kong. He seemed to be saying as well that they were free to leave. But he also made it clear that he wants young people in Hong Kong to be educated to be patriots. So there'll be lots of pressure on educators in Hong Kong to instill loyalty to the PRC. China or Xi sees or wants to see the protests of 2019, 2020 caused by socioeconomic issues, the horrible housing situation for those of limited incomes, the limited upward mobility, the economic inequality, rather than political causes related to the idea of separateness, of perhaps a separate Hong Kong identity, separate nationalism, a sense that Hong Kong should be more democratic, have those guaranteed in law, less interference by the PRC, and so on. So a lot of this means that the PRC will be monitoring Hong Kong very carefully, that there will be efforts made to deal with some of these socioeconomic issues, that while they're trying to instill a younger generation who are loyal to the PRC, silencing those who are still opposed to the kind of control that's been imposed on Hong Kong, they will be trying to appeal to people's material interests, at least to an extent. But as the PRC's economy slows, as Hong Kong's economy slows, as the effects of zero COVID continue to take place in the PRC, this promise or implicit promise is not likely to get very far, or so it appears. So, here's one of the, on the right, one of the slogans for the new era: stability, prosperity, opportunity, which are clearly what the PRC imagines for Hong Kong. It's going to be stable because we're going to exercise control. It's going to be prosperous because it will be further integrated into the Chinese economy. It will provide new opportunities for Hong Kong to be further integrated, and a mixture of the PRC and Hong Kong flags as part of the celebrations on July 1st. Okay, so those were the headlines. Let me then now switch to what's behind those headlines, what's driving these developments. And clearly one of the driving factors, or one of the explanatory factors we want to put out there, is the vision of Xi Jinping and those around him. Arguably, it's a peculiar mixture of fear, confidence, and strength, a belief in Chinese nationalism overcoming, different kinds of identities, a view of assimilation leading to uniformity, of uniting people all behind a China led by the Chinese Communist Party. Another set of factors behind the headlines were the miscalculations, desperation of actors in Hong Kong, and finally the shock effects of the coercion that was applied after the national security law was promulgated and carried out. It was a true case of arguably shock and awe, leaving very little room for the people of Hong Kong to find redress or other ways of trying to engage positively with what the PRC was imposing on Hong Kong. Okay, so Xi Jinping and those around him have manifest a fear of chaos, of disorder. Some of this may reflect Xi's own upbringing when the Cultural Revolution broke out in China. He's a 13-year-old boy at the time. His father had been arrested prior to the Cultural Revolution, had been a very high-ranking official, and his home was seized by Red Guards, and basically he lived on the streets for a couple of years. We have some evidence that he had some protection from some military officers, but for the most part, he was living on his own, in disorder, in a Beijing surrounded or in deeply disordered. And he saw this as greatly weakening, hurting China. He shared this with older Chinese who had lived through earlier periods of warlordism, of unhappiness with or disorder in China, weakness, invasion by Japan, and so on. And so for people of Xi's generation, if not older people, this fear of disorder, of chaos, is a major element of their mental worldview. And so wherever Xi has gone, he's always been someone who stands for law and order, for trying to bring about stability, unity, and strengthening party control, for fear that things will fall apart if it isn't there. There's also perhaps a metaphorical fear of contagion, of democratization, of separatism on China's periphery. And he sees perhaps arguably a ring around core China, if you will, of Hong Kong, of Xinjiang, Tibet, and Taiwan, of places that all are asserting, or appear to be asserting, that they have separate identities, that their connections to China are, in some cases, colonial, or that they're sort of imposed by force, that the people there have substantially different cultures, languages, environments, political systems, religious beliefs, and so on, that under many perspectives, they're entitled to self-determination. They have shown to varying degrees in varying ways that they're not happy being part of the PRC, and Taiwan still isn't part of the PRC. They've been sources from the party's perspective of unrest, instability. The PRC has complained about and also guarded against democratization movements on China's periphery in Central Asia, in countries near China. And every time an authoritarian regime makes a transition to democracy, the PRC police are put on higher guard, and news of democratic transitions suppressed, and so on. So the leadership in China sort of links these phenomena together. They have said repeatedly they see the United States, particularly behind the unrest in Hong Kong and Xinjiang and Tibet, Taiwan, that this is all a plot.
David, I think you accidentally muted. There we go. There.
Okay.
There, now.
Okay, sorry. So I was talking about metaphorical fear of contagion, of democratization, separatism on China's periphery, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, mixed with what China sees as support from the US for democratic movements in these places, or support for these places, as well as transition to democracy on China's periphery, such as has taken place, at least for a little bit, in Kyrgyzstan and elsewhere. There's also a fear of a return of COVID to China via Hong Kong, that if Hong Kong is more open to the outside world than China is, then the disease will leak back into China, and can't have that. So keeping Hong Kong under close wraps, keeping the border closed, seems to be part of this mindset. So these are the mindsets of fear, or the elements of fear in this view. On the other hand, Xi is arguably supremely or overly self-confident in his own understandings of how China works and how the world works, and how he can advance China's position and arguably his own at the same time through these understandings. He thinks, I think, he's smarter than other people in the room. It's not clear how much information he's getting that seems to run counter to the way he views the world. And so this can lead to disaster. And when I talk about China in 3 weeks, I'm likely to pick up on this theme, but he seems to have been able to put through the suppression of the democracy movement in Hong Kong without undue cost to the PRC, and thinks that the world is just going to have to put up with what he's done. And he's confident in the ability of the CCP to bring about what he thinks needs to be done. So he is expecting that the teachers will instill loyalty among Hong Kong kids who will grow up to be a basis of stability with the PRC, and that time favors the PRC and the CCP in this. He has a belief or a confidence that all Chinese citizens are nationalistic, patriotic, or at least can be persuaded to be. They buy into the CCP's and Xi's agenda, and therefore it's simply a matter of persuasion, of propaganda, of agitation, in the sense of people communicating this, making it clear, providing incentives, and so on and so forth. He doesn't accept the idea that there isn't one unified Chinese culture, that even if you're a Hong Konger or a Tibetan or a Uyghur in Xinjiang, you should be able to accept this view of what the PRC is, what it stands for, what its culture is, and be a part of it. In other words, if not forced assimilation, and a downplaying of all kinds of difference. And there's a strength in his belief that the CCP has the power and the will to bring about a much more homogeneous, disciplined, and ordered China that includes Hong Kong. So these are the combination of concerns, fears, confidence, belief in the strength of the CCP, the belief in the mission of the CCP and of Xi Jinping himself to bring about China's rise to great power status, and that nothing is going to stand in its way. Okay. In terms of the miscalculation and desperation of the Hong Kongers. First, I want to be clear, I'm not blaming the victims here for mistakes they made. That it's not clear that there was any way by which the popular demands for political change, greater democratization, and the relatively few calls for an independent Hong Kong were ever going to be satisfied. So in that sense, we can say they miscalculated, but it was a miscalculation born of a sense of profound frustration, upset with the growing influence of the PRC in Hong Kong. What was unclear was how the mass protests would find sort of pathways to action that could reverse that Chinese influence, that could bring about a more democratic Hong Kong, of practical measures that would get the government, the Hong Kong government, to throw open the electoral process to all people, to vote on the chief executive, to make the legislative council elected by popular vote in all cases, and so on. How do you safeguard legal and constitutional rights that were in the Sino-British agreements and in China's original mini-constitution for Hong Kong? So they didn't really have much choice but to protest. Unfortunately, the Hong Kong administration was unresponsive to most people. They were seen as beholden to the Hong Kong billionaires and to the CCP. So this meant that, unfortunately, the protests were unlikely to end well. Would Hong Kong be in a better place if people hadn't protested? That's a hard one to say, that maybe the crackdown wouldn't have been severe, but there were clear signs that China was going to increase its hold over Hong Kong, that Hong Kong was going to lose some of its special legal status anyway. So arguably better to sort of reveal the full nature of this than perhaps to sit quietly while this process takes place. That's easy for me to say sitting here in Washington and not being in Hong Kong and not being involved in this. And I'm sure the calculations that ordinary Hong Kong people had to make are much starker and much more unpleasant than the way I've just portrayed it here. Okay. And then there's the shock. Most of the protests were nonviolent. They were met with police violence, but not so much violence as to deter or crush the idea of further protests. In fact, the police violence often provoked more protests. So there was violence and people were hurt, but it wasn't so great as to inhibit people from engaging in more protests. And indeed, they were shocked at the violent behavior by the police. And so they came out in greater force to show they weren't going to be intimidated, that the police limited violence was a violation of what they expected of what had been a highly professionalized Hong Kong police force. And generally, as the protests were going on in 2019, 2020, non-governmental political leaders had not been threatened with arrest. One might have, but they were often bailed out. They were arrested, for minor charges of public unrest or of low-level public unrest and things like that. Things that might, if you've been convicted, have a 30-day sentence, misdemeanors in some ways. It appears that Hong Kongers didn't seem to believe that the PRC would write, promulgate, and implement the national security law for Hong Kong. So they were shocked when that happened. The PRC then used the national security law to target opposition leaders. They decapitated, in the language of protest, the movement leaders, took away their leadership, the people who were at the nodes of many networks and who could easily coordinate. They also took away many others and they made it clear that further protests would be met forcefully. And there didn't seem to be any effective counter to the state's power and determination. The police were fully backed up by the PRC's People's Armed Police and by the military garrison in Hong Kong of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. They didn't play a role in the forefront, but they were present, and it was clear that the police had the backup of Chinese agents of coercion. So people were aware of this, and as a result, they were intimidated, shocked, and the situation went to much greater PRC control. So in conclusion, Hong Kong is a very different place than it was 3 years ago, but it's still different than the mainland, although the trajectory is in the direction of gradual convergence of Hong Kong on the mainland type system. Hong Kong appears to be stable, but we could ask, how stable is that? 20 years or more ago, a dissident, a Chinese dissident, fled Hong Kong, and fled the PRC, and she argued that there was stability in China, but she saw it as a as a volcanic stability, that the pressure of geographic or geologic surges underneath the Earth's crust were building up. And so ultimately, this would culminate in an eruption that would fundamentally shatter the stability. We can use this metaphor perhaps to think about Hong Kong, and maybe to console ourselves that this might be the future. But we're left with this question about how stable is Hong Kong? Did the people, the millions of people who participated in protests, permanently put aside their hope for a more free and democratic future? Did they put them in the back of their minds? Did they otherwise try to sort of compartmentalize their minds? Did some of them make up their minds to leave Hong Kong? All of these are questions we're still seeing unfold and perhaps work themselves out. This leaves open the question also of what happens if mass protest breaks out on the mainland. And as you'll hear in 3 weeks, there are lots of dissatisfied people in the PRC right now for a variety of reasons. It's easy again for outside observers, not part of the situation, to say there are a lot of people who are on the verge of saying, I'm fed up and I'm not going to take it anymore. Although they don't, those of us outside of China don't face quite daunting prospects that go with that conclusion. Can ask, can Hong Kong's economic dynamism be restored? Can the inequalities be mitigated? And if they can't, what happens then? And so let me just turn to 5 books that you might find interesting if you're interested in more on the contemporary scene in Hong Kong. Louisa Lim's book, Indelible City, Ho Fang Hong's City on the Edge, Michael Davis's Making Hong Kong China, Kevin Caraco's Two Systems, Two China, and Jeffrey Wasserstrom's Vigil, which is now a little out of date, but anyway, it's a good read. So with that, I will stop the presentation and stop the share. I guess we're going to break, right?
Yep. Thank you so much, David. Great talk. Everybody be back here in 5 minutes, so 27 after the hour, and we'll take questions. Thank you.